Good evening. This is Jeff J. Brown, China Rising Radio, Sinoland from Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I am super pleased to have on the show today Mr. Amir Khan. How are you doing, Amir?
I'm doing very well, Jeff.
Hey, listen, I think you're in Dalian, China right now, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Up by Korea and Japan.
Yes.
A long way from Chiang Mai. Hey, listen, the reason we're here together is because I read Amir's, well, actually, I think he's written three books, or two or three books, but I've read his book about cinema, and I'm really super happy to have him on the show. His book is called Comedies of Nihilism, the representation of tragedy on screen. So that will be the focus of our discussion today. I highly recommend to all China Rising Radio Sign fans to read Amir's very engaging and informative book about all things movies. For film hounds, it's a must. It is available in ebook and print format below. This will be on the article page on China Rising Radio Sign. If you don't have the money, ask your local library or school to order it. They have an annual budget to buy books and love it when readers make requests. I will include Amir's email if you'd like to contact him later. He has a website page where he is teaching at the Dalian Maritime University, and I have the link to buy the book. So, welcome to the show, Amir.
I'm very happy to be on China Rising Radio Sino. Truly. Really.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself, the past and present, and your arc of awareness about the connection between movies and global imperialism.
Okay, first thing I'll mention is that I'm Canadian. I'm working in China, as you mentioned, Dalian Maritime University. But I finished a PhD at the University of Ottawa in 2013. And I wrote, my first book was my dissertation, which was on Shakespearean tragedy. And my second book is a book of film criticism, Comedies of Nihilism, which we'll be discussing today. And basically, one of the things that got me thinking about cinema after writing about Shakespearean tragedy was just wondering if anything at all like tragedy is actually can be rendered in kind of a similar way on the cinema screen. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about that question a lot, and I wrote my second book sort of at the same time as I wrote my dissertation.
Okay.
It's kind of, I was on the side, yeah. So both of those books came out or were published relatively close together. But my central thesis in the book is that movies are about nihilism and are about meaninglessness. The most serious movies, the most serious movies that we maybe consume, and take them to just maybe kind of be like popular, maybe not giving them much thought, much serious thought. But I think that there is a sort of a message, a very serious message that is sort of rendered very well in the movies that I talk about. But it is this idea of sort of cultural meaninglessness or nihilism. And, you could call it sort of a type of decadence. They're sort of critiquing Western decadence. Now, there's all sorts of ways that decadence, appears in these movies. And I'll say at the outset that it's a book of aesthetic criticism. So it's a close reading of the films themselves. So I'm talking about what's going on internal to the films, and I don't really spend a whole lot of time discussing, say the social, political, economic realities surrounding these films that maybe have led to these feelings of nihilism and cultural decadence. But of course, those things also matter. One thing I'll say, just in terms of the connection between movies and global imperialism, is that one thing to keep in mind, sort of one of the outer reasons why movies really can't get anything across that are, very meaningful anymore. One reason, I think, is because movies are so capital intensive, and because it's so capital intensive, it means that there's a lot of risk. in making a movie. And when there's a lot of risk in making a movie, people are not as willing to tell interesting stories or to tell anything that could maybe rock the boat in any significant way. So that is one reason I think that these movies are sort of aware of being hemmed in that way, and are sort of responding to that. And like I say, they're not responding to it by, say, critiquing society or critiquing the social or political or economic realities that movies find themselves in. But I think they're critiquing something that we feel when we watch movies nowadays, which is we feel like they don't really have anything to say that they are able to say with any kind of sincerity and get that across in any sort of meaningful way.
Yeah. And that's why we have Spider-Man 7 and
in a way, right?
Superman 12 and
like in that article that you sent me, right? Like that's what Martin Scorsese was saying. Like all of those movies have been vetted and audience tested over and over again, and only when they work are they released, right? Yeah. But that sort of takes away from any kind of, we know what we're getting in advance kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, listen, in Comedies of Nihilism, you review, analyze, and critique 8 very diverse movies. And you frequently cite Stanley Cavell, and I'll spell his family name for the fans out there. It's Cavell. And I have read, Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert and Leonard Maltin and a little bit of Pauline Kael back in her heyday. But before we get to the movies, why do you think Cavell is so important among movie critics?
Stanley Cavell, the late Stanley Cavell, he passed away recently in 2018. He's a major influence in all of my thinking and all of my writing, even my writing on Shakespeare. But I think the reason it's important to acknowledge, at least for me, to acknowledge Stanley Cavell, is he was sort of a pioneer in writing about film very seriously. Nowadays, you look around and you see departments of film studies at universities everywhere, departments of cinema studies. It's very common for people to get, an MA or a PhD, by studying film. And even like popular culture, it's sort of taken for granted. It's very much sort of the academic norm or academic fad right now to write about these things. Anything you see like on TV, like a Netflix series or even like a YouTube, show or anything like that. There's a good chance that somebody out there in the academy has written about it, a serious monograph or article study about all of that kind of stuff. But Stanley Cavell, again, was writing about film before all of this sort of became popular. He was sort of a pioneer in that regard. Okay. So he wrote two very important books. Yeah, he wrote two very important books. The first is The Worldview, published in 1971. And the second, my favorite, Pursuits of Happiness, 1981. And he did it, from the institutional vantage point of philosophy. Okay, so philosophy is always a bit reticent about, they do talk a lot about aesthetics and why we feel the things that we feel. But, when you're talking about aesthetics, philosophers probably feel that you're much better off looking at a philosophical treatise by, Kant or Plato, than you are to read a Shakespearean play.
Yeah.
So there is this sort of tension between philosophy and literature already. Reading any works of sort of imagination, there's always it's always suspect, I think, in philosophy departments, a little bit anyhow. But Stanley Cavell sort of went on further, and he started talking about movies. At a time when movies, weren't considered necessarily high art, by any means, right? And not only did he talk about the movies, he didn't talk about like some, French foreign films or some avant-garde theater that's very obscure or anything. In Pursuits of Happiness, anyway, he talks about early Hollywood talkies, which were considered, the late 1930s or early 1940s. And, those were essentially dismissed as sort of romantic potboilers where, there's a happy ending. And, the Philadelphia Story is probably like, the landmark kind of there, or the most Yeah, the most notable one that he talks about. And nobody at that time would ever consider giving any type of academic seriousness or academic scrutiny to a film like, The Philadelphia Story, and certainly not philosophical scrutiny, putting a philosopher like Kant next to a discussion of the Philadelphia Story. It was just something you didn't do. So Stanley Cavell is very unique in that way, and that he sort of achieved that, and he's managed to garner, I wouldn't say, the mainstream of philosophy has sort of, been very taken with his work, but he does have, I guess you could say, sort of a cult following, and Stanley Cavell is very respected within, philosophical circles and stuff like that. But he did something where he thought movies, which definitely were taken to be, what you might call a low type of art, he thought there was something very philosophically significant and important happening in those films. And in the same way, in my book, these 7 comedies, you could almost dismiss them as a type of stoner comedy. It's just what teenage kids might watch on the weekend when they're, doing certain things. Yeah, but I think that if they do have that kind of appeal, definitely. But I also think that there's something very serious going on in these films. They are hilarious, they are ridiculous at times, but they're also very profound. So Stanley Cavell is, a pioneer in allowing me to do the kind of work that I do.
Okay, cool.
And that's why it's very important.
Let's start with movie number 1, Up in the Air, and in your review of the movie Up in the Air, you talk about a manufactured word quite a bit, glocal, Glocal, and I loved it because it's really cool. It's what English teachers call a portmanteau, which is it's actually it's a French word for a hanger, to hang clothes, and that's squishing 2 words together to make a new one, like brunch, for breakfast and lunch. So glocal is like, global and local. What does it mean to you when reflect about the word glocal when reflecting about today's mainstream headlines?
So glocal is the word uttered by the Natalie Keener character played by Anna Kendrick in Up in the Air. And she's making kind of a business presentation at the time. I'll give just a brief primer of the movie Up in the Air. So basically, George Clooney, who plays Ryan Bingham, and Anna Kendrick, who plays Natalie Keener, both of them work for a firm. And the job of the firm is to fire people. So basically, companies will hire these characters, will hire them to do their dirty work, like let's say in lieu of an HR department or something. They will hire the people who work for this firm that George Clooney and the Anna Kendrick that they work for, and then they will go and they will offer a severance package or whatever, and let the person know that they have been let go because the company is too afraid to do it themselves. So that's what's going on in the movie, and basically, Ryan Bingham, George Clooney, does it the old way, where he actually meets people face to face and shakes their hands or whatever before he tells them, okay, you're fired, kind of like Donald Trump or something. So he does it that way. And Anna Kendrick, the Anna Kendrick character, Natalie Keener, comes in and she wants to change everything. She wants to now do it by video screen. Yeah. And the logic that she uses, she's making kind of a pitch to her boss, is she's saying, we have to make the global local. So we have to take something that works. Yeah, we have to take something that works kind of like, in the name of efficiency or in the name of profit, right? On a sort of a grander scale, allows us to do these things in a more efficient way and more, in a more profitable way. But we have to make it feel like it's like we're standing in person, like we're standing next to them in person. So we have to make the global local. So your question about today's headlines. I think that and I say this in the film, that something like that betrays a direction of knowledge or a sort of the direction of the types of business strategies that are in place or that are going on all over the world, in whatever industries, maybe even in the film industry, certainly in this industry that they're talking about in this movie, and that they're not actually seeking to take something that's local, right, and make it global. So the word is not global, Okay, because first of all, that word doesn't sound as good. Global just sounds better. But the idea is that you don't, businesses are not interested in taking things that are happening in the grassroots and sort of blowing them up. And, that's not the direction, I think, that sort of late capitalism, the times that we find ourselves in now. We're more interested in sort of imposing, from something global. We want that to be local, and how that might play out, let's say in movies or in cinema or in terms of an idea of nihilism, is that when stories or representations or even business strategies come from elsewhere and are imposed upon people, they don't speak to people's actual experiences on the ground. And if they don't speak to people's actual experiences on the ground, stories, for example, then the stories themselves become kind of meaningless. And that type of logic leads to a type of nihilism. Already knowing the answers in advance kind of thing.
Okay, cool. In the same critique for the movie Up in the Air, you talk about Canada being a cultural mirror for the rest of the world. Why?
Okay, that's a very good question. And
since you are Canadian.
Sure. And one of the most outrageous things that I attempt to do in the book, okay, is I have this sort of double-pronged thesis. I want to equate the failed aesthetic promise of movies. Movies don't really have anything to go. They don't have anything left to say, particularly under the constraints that they currently find themselves in. They can't say anything meaningful. I want to equate that feeling with the failed national politics of Canada. Yeah. And that's kind of, I call it like a subplot. And so now how does that work? What I think is, in terms of sovereignty, the politics of Canada, in terms of building a sense of sovereignty or a sovereign nation, has truly failed. And why is that? There's two main reasons. First of all, by virtue of its geography alone, and by virtue of its language alone, we're right, of course, next to the United States. And we speak the same language as the United States. So the cultural onslaught that we get from this English-speaking behemoth to the south is so powerful and so daunting that for us to even have attempted as a nation to carve out a sense of sovereignty for ourselves was sort of it was never possible to begin with.
It was like a pipe dream.
Kind of, yeah, exactly, no, totally. And this isn't something that I'm just realizing now. This is something that was written about very seriously by, I say a host of, I call them sort of Canadian philosophers who rose to prominence in the 1950s and 60s and even the 70s. They understood this problem very well, very acutely, and they were theorizing about it. And what I felt was when I was reading their work, and what they were saying, it's sort of the same feeling that I have when I watch certain movies, these 7 movies, these comedies of nihilism, because they're kind of saying the same thing in a different way. They're just saying that we are at the end of an expressive medium of cinema that is exhausted. And what these theorists were saying is kind of like, we are at the end of this cultural experiment that we tried, which is called Canada. That has totally failed. Yeah, and I'm trying to make the case that both of those feelings are the same. And one book that I talk about a lot, that is the father of Canadian philosophical pessimism, you could say, is George Grant. He wrote a book in 1965. He called it Lament for a Nation. Okay, that was in 1965. Yeah. And in that book, he declared Canada, is no longer a sovereign nation. And really how you have to, that far back.
Wow.
And really how you have to think about it is that when you are on the receiving end of the cultural shockwaves, if you're not interested in the idea of sovereignty, if you're not interested in that question, I think Canadians today are just largely uninterested in even asking this question. They just take it for granted. They have a flag and they have a currency and they have an anthem and they think, okay, so we're a nation. But they don't really ask themselves what this possibly means and whether or not, by virtue of the fact, okay, first of all, the geographic location, by virtue of that fact, that's one. Number two, we speak the same language as the Americans. So, and if we speak the same language, it's very possible, we definitely speak the same language. And if we think in the same language, why is it so hard to believe that we actually think the same? because all of our media in Canada and all of our, the things that we consume in the English language, I mean, the bulk of them we are just bombarded, of course, by the cultural onslaught emanating from the United States. And a country like Mexico, let's say, could at least hope, and I'm not saying that they've been successful in doing this in any way, maybe they have, maybe not, but at least in the language, in the Spanish language, you could at least hope to carve out some sort of sovereignty for yourself, for your country, but lacking any type of bulwark in that sense, speaking and carrying on in English and just taking your identity for granted in a way means that you have no identity. And I do think that that's true. And so just going to your question about a mirror for the rest of the world, George Grant even says this. He says, much greater traditions are going to go than minor loyalist traditions, than just minor, loyalists. We were loyal to the British Crown, when the Americans declared independence. We're a minor loyalist tradition. There are much greater traditions out there that the cultural onslaught of American cultural hegemony is going to just bowl over. And it's happening, it's happened. And I think anywhere that English goes, you have to deal with this import. This cultural import. I mean, the language is a force, and the English-speaking language is a force. And if other nations were sort of interested, maybe, in reading about Canada's effacement, that, in a sense, Canada could be a cultural mirror in the way that you speak of.
Yeah, that's really well said. I also I loved your comment that the computer does not impose on the way it should be used. In other words, it's up to the user to make it useful or diabolical. Are you a Luddite, a tech slave, or somewhere in between?
Okay, that's a good question. So this is also a phrasing by George Grant. He's talking about technology. And again, that was in my discussion of Up in the Air. And it goes to that idea of the computer does not impose on us the way that it should be used. That sounds factually true. No technology tells us how to use it. Technology is neutral. And human beings can decide whether to use it or not to use it. And we want to believe that that's true, but I don't think that really is true. In the movie, in Up in the Air, they have a choice. We can fire people by meeting them in person and spending a lot of money and doing it that way for humanistic reasons. Or we can do it via video screen and maximize profits. Like, we know the answer. Do you see what I mean? The technology has already imposed the answer on us. The technology and the logic of late capitalism and stuff like that. So, I mean, I would say I'm a Marxist. And I'm suspicious of technology in the way that Marx was suspicious of technology in what he calls technology fetishism. If we can do something by virtue of technology, it's making a humanistic stance or taking a humanistic sort of opposition to but we shouldn't do it that way because it's not right or anything. It's almost ridiculous in and of itself. Yeah. If we have the technological capability to do it, we're just going to do it. I mean, it's just going to happen. And in the film, George Clooney's boss, played by Jason Bateman, Craig Gregory, he kind of says it. He says, Coke and IBM have been doing this for years. Ever heard of them? Well, there you have it. Okay, if Coke and IBM are doing it, I mean, what's the chance that Clooney have, or Ryan Bingham in the movie, of stopping this logic, right? If we can do it, we will do it. So, in a way, I'm a Luddite in the sense that, yes, I'm suspicious. But I'm also a tech slave. I know that there's no way you can stop it. Yeah. If we can do it, it's just going to happen. Technology imposes its own logic. Yeah, and I think that's very dangerous.
Another great comment you made is, and this one I thought was quite profound. You made the statement that the ascent of the novel would not have been possible without the rise of the nation state. Please tell us about that.
That is Ian Watt's thesis. So I was talking about the book by Ian Watt. He wrote a book in 1957 called The Rise of the Novel. And he's talking about the 18th century novel. And definitely, the novel was very useful to, a political project of nation building. And nation building is also very politically useful to a project of building markets. So the novel was kind of like the perfect art form for the rise of the nation state. I mean, this is kind of what Ian Watt is saying. Novels are consumed in private. You know, you create this private sphere that actually never existed before. A person in his reading room reading a novel consumes the novel alone. So a lot of, you know, the rhetoric of, you know, private property and stuff stress this idea of the individual and how important the individual is.
Okay,
So a novel as an art form, yeah, a novel as an art form sort of could exploit that. I mean, it created, it's not like going to the theater, which is kind of a communal experience, right? It's an aesthetic experience that you have in private, in a way. But the novel also instructs the individual on how he or she ought to live or perceive or take note of what's happening in the life of his or her nation. Yeah. Usually the main protagonist, you know, is involved in all kinds of ways, and, you know, things that are going on, you know, in the country, or things that are of national importance or whatever. So the novel helps us understand ourselves, you know, as private citizens within a public administrative structure known as a nation. So the rise of the novel, yeah, it's almost the perfect art form with the rise of the nation state. And I say inversely, you know, the movies are the opposite. That movies are concomitant with the decline of the nation state or the decline of the West. I say that movies are Spenglerian, yeah. So, and, you know, I can just kind of go on a little bit about that. The novels, in a sense, John Ralston Saul makes this point, and I cite him in my book, you know, novels are participatory. Words are more participatory. They require an active imagination. You have to imagine yourself in and amongst the community that you live in. Yeah, because you're only given the words. You're not really, you're free to imagine how those words mean to you. And you have much more freedom than you do when you're given an image. Because an image, all of that is sort of dictated to you and imposed on you. It's, you consume cinema in a much more passive way. And I would say, you know, kind of inversely to Ian Watt's thesis, that the rise of cinema, in order for the nation to be represented in the cinema, the imagination, to imagine the nation, all of that's to the imagination, the nation has to be imaginatively sorted out already. There has to be like a stable sort of idea of what the nation is. It gets represented on screen, and we just sort of passively consume it. So that means that, in a way, nationalism or the nation has already sort of reached its height, in a way, and is over the hill, and is now maybe online. And once it's reached that stage, you know, then cinema is maybe a more natural fit as a democratic art form.
Fascinating. Movie number 2, Tropic Thunder. And this is the one movie, I'm embarrassed to say, but this is the one movie you critique that I saw, and that was a long time ago. I had forgotten that it was a movie being shot within a movie until I read your chapter on Tropic Thunder. And I remember it had Ben Stiller, and I remember it as kind of a grotesque spoof on war and racism, you know, set in Vietnam, maybe even trying to desensitize us to them and to, you know, war and racism. So just since I saw the movie and it kind of gave me a different perspective in reading it, just tell us what Tropic Thunder meant to you and, you know, why you included it in the book.
Okay, Tropic Thunder is in many ways, I mean, it's almost like a, you know, like a quintessential or sort of a telltale, you know, in the genre that I'm talking about, because like you said, the spoofery seems just endless, you know. Ben Stiller almost seems to be, you know, spoofing in a very aggressive fashion. I mean, just anything. There is nothing that is sort of sacred in this movie, you know, and, you know, the sort of the shibboleths of identity politics are all spoofed very early on, right in the beginning, you know, whether it's, you know, discussions about intellectual disability, or it's discussions about obesity, or it's discussions about race relations and hip-hop culture, or it's discussions about homosexuality. I mean, all of it is just kind of made fun of and spoofed, all of the things that we think are very important in our lives, and sort of all of our sacred cows. So that's great. Now, in a lot of ways, yeah, Tropic Thunder again just looks like it's spoofing for the sake of spoofing, and the levels of irony I think are very intelligent. Like you said, there's a movie shot within the movie, and what we are aware of that we are watching a movie about the making of a movie, the movie in the movie. It's also called Tropic Thunder. Yeah, we're watching a movie about the making of a movie called Tropic Thunder.
That's right.
And the movie in the movie is based on a memoir, also called Tropic Thunder, of a Vietnam War hero. And in the movie, that memoir turns out to be fake. Yeah. So there's all kinds of layers of irony. I mean, there's 3 or 4 right there. And it almost just seems like, it does, it seems ridiculous. It just seems like, okay, where are we going with any of this? And I certainly don't say that the film is ridiculous, even though it seems that way, prima facie. But definitely, I think it is a very intelligent movie. And like you say, Ben Stiller is a star, and he's also the director. And what do I think that he's trying to say in this film? Definitely what I think he's doing is the main line of critique, or the main line of spoofery that he's talking about, are the representation of the American war experience in Vietnam. That is first and foremost, I think, what that movie is talking about. I mean, there was a very famous Vietnam war movie called Rolling Thunder. This one's called Tropic Thunder. And, the movie's by Oliver Stone. Yeah, movies by Oliver Stone, Born on the 4th of July, and
Deer Hunter.
Platoon, yeah, and Deer Hunter, of course, another one. So there is a whole genre of movies that attempted to do something. And it's really interesting if you think about probably what they were attempting to do. They were trying to sort of deal with the trauma of the American war experience in Vietnam. And still to this day, right, it's still not clear to Americans or, what we were doing in Vietnam, whether they were good in their intentions. And I think even Bill Clinton, he even said, our intentions were originally good. I mean, we just got caught up in all of these, things that it just got taken, it went too far. So I don't even know if America itself is clear on whether or not it should have been there or shouldn't have been there, or was there with good intentions and just kind of mucked things up tactically rather than morally. Now, one thing that all of these movies do, and, again, John Ralston Saul has a great critique of Platoon, which I think I footnote in my book. In those movies, this is interesting, the American war experience in Vietnam becomes a morality play. Like, why the Vietnamese were fighting, or what their political agenda was, or why they felt the need to go to war with America themselves, or to fight back. I mean, they were attacked. This was an aggressor nation invading their country. But why never are these movies ever interested very much on the Vietnamese story, and where they're coming from and what their political beliefs are. So what happens is, yes, okay, it was a bad thing that we were in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese people are sometimes, they're represented, but they're only as props, just to kind of have this morality play going on where it's about America and it's about the individual consciousness, and America's trying to exercise its own demons. Even the finest, so-called films, like Platoon. Platoon is very much like this. It's a total denial of the other, of Vietnam's experience, in this horrible act of, aggression.
Killing millions.
Sure, definitely. Now, so, and here's the thing, right? Like, C. Wright Mills wrote this book in 1957 called The Power Elite, and President Eisenhower warned the nation about this military-industrial complex. And then suddenly America went to the movies, after the power elite and the military-industrial complex sort of wreaked havoc on Vietnam. America went to the movies to attempt to deal with this trauma, and there was all this moral hand-wringing, and there was supposed to be this sort of catharsis or sort of change in the American experience or psyche or whatever. And really what they were trying to do is they're trying to curb, in a way, the American war machine. If we're repentant, then at least we should stop doing the things that we did, like Vietnam. But if you look at the 21st century, there's already been 4 Vietnams, at least, okay? Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Syria, and there's more. You count Sudan or Somalia, and you count, Yemen. I mean, they're all over the place. So what this movie, Tropic Thunder, is expressing, I think, the frustration that it's expressing, and why it's spoofing, in such an aggressive manner, is because we, or that generation, let's say Ben Stiller's generation, went to the movie, and were made to go through all this moral confab, made to go through all of this, hand wringing, and oh my God, it's such a terrible thing we did, and it has not changed anything. It has not changed a single thing in the American experience or how the American war machine operates. If you look at something like, okay, so now like the military-industrial complex has become, in common parlance nowadays, is like the deep state. And the deep state is much more prevalent in our lives than, what we took the military-industrial complex to be, or what we took, the power elite to be. I mean, and they're much more entrenched. And there's nothing we can do about it. There's no way movie can change the life of a nation the way that it wanted to. And that, I think, is a vision of nihilism. And I think that's what Tropic Thunder is trying to get across.
Well, maybe I'm going to watch that movie again. In fact, maybe after I retire, I'll go back and watch all these movies, because after reading your book, they really they came alive for me, even though this is the only one I saw. But I really should go back and watch them when I have the time. Movie number 3, JCVD, and that stands for Jean-Claude Van Damme. And when my wife and I owned a CD and DVD store in France in the late 1990s, of course we're in France, and Jean-Claude Van Damme, I'm pretty sure he's from Belgium, isn't he?
Correct.
Anyway,
yes. The muscles from Brussels.
Yeah. I always took Jean-Claude Van Damme as a bit of a joke. We would get his DVDs and stuff, in the store, like a grade B actor. Yet Rotten Tomatoes gives his movie that you reviewed, JCVD, the initials of his name, very high marks. I mean, Rotten, I think it's like 85 or 86% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is like sky high. Here are some notes I took while reading your chapter on the book. You wrote, "We live violence by proxy through watching films. The function of civil society is that action movies purge us of our violent proclivities, as the case has been made, rather than exacerbate them." So do you agree or disagree? Why or why not?
Well, I think, the case has been made. I mean, I think most famously, you could probably say by Aristotle. He was responding to Plato and Socrates, who famously banned the poet from the Republic. So we don't need tragedy in the Republic. It's kind of interesting and aesthetically pleasing, but we don't need that stuff, in the ideal city. And they also left the door open. If anybody can think of a reason why we should let the poet back in, you're free to comment. And a generation or so later, Aristotle, came along and he just said, no, the tragedians are good, and tragedy is good because it allows us to achieve this catharsis or purging of pity and terror. So it's kind of has psychological uses, and he says, that's good for the soul. And now that kind of argument has been made about violence and even sex in movies, right? That when we go to the movies and we see all this violence and we see all this sex, it gets it out of our system, and it's actually it does sort of a kind of an ethical work, and it's actually good for the soul. It's true. Yeah, people actually argue these. Yeah. So we need to keep it in there or whatever. Anyway, so whether I agree with that or not, I guess I generally no. Definitely no. I don't think I agree with that. But in terms of why there's so much violence and so much, sex and pornography, particularly in the West, I just think that is a symptom rather than a cause of nihilism. Yeah. We know that we have nothing very significant to say otherwise, so sometimes we try and hide that or mask it through sort of exhibitionism. And that's why you see kind of these, that's why Western movies in particular always have a tendency to stylize violence and sex, in a way that probably, no other art form or no other industry is really interested in doing.
Well, they're talking about that right now with the movie The Joker, they're using they're talking about the same thing. Is he causing people to be violent, or is he helping us, is he helping us, appease our desires, and reduce our desires for violence, etc. So, All right. Another one you said, women are held silent throughout the movie. But as it progresses, the men are silenced, which says that the further pacification or feminization of men in American cinema has now clipped its action stars, and of course Van Damme, is an action star, who are no longer able to speak or act. So men are forced to love and be silent, as less expressing female subjectivity than survival. The systematic loss of subjectivities is tragic. Man, that's deep. Tell us what you think.
Okay, sure. I wrote that. I was trying to address, because in the movie JCVD, there is no significant female role. And I wanted to address why I thought that was the case a little bit. Now, I'll just sort of say, in terms of the pacification of the American male, that's something unique, I think, to American cinema. Like the American leading male, right? I mean, if you just think of like the Cary Grant or the Spencer Tracys, are not, they need to be, in order to get to the happy ending, that we want as a romantic leading male in American cinema, you cannot be sort of aggressive in a way. You have to be feminized, or you have to be pacified in a way. So as Stanley Cavell puts it, like the person who is the candidate maybe to be like a leading American actor, protagonist, has to be willing to be struck down. I mean, in a way, you have to show that you're not so proud, that you can kind of handle, kind of a humiliation of sorts, and still retain your dignity and still be a man that way. That's true, right? I think that's true. Like, definitely in the romantic comedy tradition, it's not like a knight in shining armor comes and sweeps the woman off her feet and that's it, In a way, no. You have to kind of know how to seduce a woman. You have to talk to a woman. You have to be gentle. You have to be a gentleman. And so the leading male of American cinema has always been sort of pacified. And you could think of the genre of the hard action movies, which came to prominence, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and even maybe Westerns in a way, as sort of a pushback to this type of trend that was going on in sort of the mainstream of American cinema. That males need to be sort of strong, silent, not speak so much, and just get in there and and get the woman not by sweet talking her, but just by kicking ass and getting things done. So there was this kind of pushback, I think, and there was a lot of appeal to these kinds of hard action movie stars, especially about this, Jeff. I grew up in the 80s, and Stallone, Schwarzenegger.
Oh yeah, and also Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry.
Sure. Yeah. That was in that genre too. But then also Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme. I think those for me were the big four. And whenever they had a new movie coming out, I just remember I was a kid and I was so excited to go see the new action movie. And what I claim is, like, there's another genre of movies that he gets to the end. Jean-Claude Van Damme. That is kind of explored very intelligently, I think, in that film. Jean-Claude Van Damme, in that movie, he plays himself. But he has everyday kind of problems, just like the rest of us. He has a custody hearing. He's trying to transfer money over to the States so that his lawyer has enough money to defend him in his custody hearing. And he can't get anything done, not in the manner of what you think of somebody like Jean-Claude Van Damme could do it in, like action movies. Yeah. It's just kind of ordinary, everyday stuff. And Jean-Claude Van Damme, that's true. He was taken to be a joke, especially in Europe, because he did a lot of quasi-philosophizing, and I think like on a TV series, but not in any of his, hard action movies per se. But he's always trying to kind of explain and make sense of his life. And I think, Jean-Claude Van Damme, in the genre of movies that he finds himself in, he finds himself silenced by the very genre of movie he started. I can't explain my life by using, the hard action formulas that, worked for me in my movies, and I'm trying to kind of philosophize them and talk about them, but I also still can't make sense of them in any way. And in a way, as that movie progresses, he is silenced. He's silenced by the work that he's done previously, and he doesn't really know how to speak about or even if he's found any newfound knowledge, or again had any sort of cathartic experience because of his life, because of his career. And it's very sad and it's very sort of tragic, and he's presented himself, playing himself in a very kind of vulnerable way. And at the end of the movie, I shouldn't give away spoilers here, but he's arrested for charges of extortion, and he's heading off to jail. And then there's a person sticks a microphone in his face like a reporter and says, asks him to comment or whatever. And Jean-Claude Van Damme just, I think it's kind of a telling moment in the film, just kind of brushes her off and refuses to answer. He refuses to speak. It's almost like by the time, at the end of the film, he's kind of refused to try and explain his life in any way to himself or to his friends that makes sense, because the expressive possibilities are lost. I think that's kind of the realization that he comes to, and I make the case that he is kind of silenced in the way that we normally think women are silenced. And I kind of make another outrageous reading. I kind of say that I compare his tale to the King Lear tale in Cordelia, who says maybe I should just love and be silent. But of course, Cordelia is not silent. She actually speaks up, and then the whole tragedy of Lear unfolds. And the lesson maybe would be that, okay, women should just keep silent, or, not speak out. Not saying that that's what I think it should be or anything like that. But I think that in JCVD, similarly, he also learned, like, okay, it's too treacherous for me to speak out at this moment. I speak out. And I've been silenced in a way.
Especially today with all of the freaking... identity politics, and what is the awoken or the awakened, the woke
movement, all of that stuff.
It's just like they say comedians can't even do comedy anymore. So
right.
All right, movie number 4, Winnebago Man, and you wrote that a documentary. Of course, this is a documentary. You wrote that a documentary watching a man being degraded or degrading himself is only enjoyable when we don't know that person. Otherwise, it's spoiled. Please explain that.
Yes, and that is a quotation in the film by Charlie Sotelo and Cinco Barnes, who are a couple of film buffs. And I'll just give a bit of a primer here about this movie, Winnebago Man. So Winnebago Man is a documentary, and it documents Ben Steinbauer. He's the director. He goes in search of the Winnebago Man. And the Winnebago Man is a person who came to some notoriety. He was originally, I think sometime in the 80s, he was the promotional lead, or he appeared in these promotional videos for Winnebago Industries, advertising for the Itasca Sunflyer RV. And at one, as he's shooting, he's this polished, urbane sort of salesperson. And then suddenly, like a fly would come into the room, or it'd be too hot or something, he would just start swearing. I mean, just very comically, very funny. You see kind of this polished, urbane human being, and you just see him losing his temper. Anyhow, apparently, unfortunately, there were some people on set working with him who distributed the outtakes via VHS by recording them over and over again. And they got spread around somehow, anyway, it was he became too much of a liability for Winnebago Industries, so they let him go. They fired him. And then with the rise of the internet and with the rise of YouTube in the 90s, those same clips were disseminated electronically. And Jack Redney, the Winnebago Man, who's always losing his temper, became sort of an internet celebrity. But the idea, and this is showcased in the movie, is that he actually, after the humiliation of all of that, he went into hiding. And Ben Steinbauer, the film's director, goes in search of him. And he's talking to some people in the lead up to, finding the Winnebago Man, and he talks to Charlie Sotelo and Cinco Barnes, and they say, no, why are you going? I mean, they're not actually talking to Ben Steinbauer, but they're saying, I don't want to know the person who I watch in these degrading videos. It's no fun. It's only fun to watch these videos of somebody kind of making themselves. Yeah, it's only fun if I don't know the person. So, I mean, in that way, sort of saying it's a type of schadenfreude, right? I'm only enjoying these videos, or I only watch these videos because I'm watching a person who isn't me getting humiliated, and that's great. But the interesting thing is that Ben Steinbauer, who's a film director, doesn't do it for reasons of schadenfreude. he loves those videos. He watches them. He consumes them. But he's going, I think, in search of Jack Rebney, the Winnebago Man, to discover why he's so fascinated. And he presents this idea, and he's basing the idea, okay, maybe it's only Schadenfreude in me, but I don't think it really is. And the movie is really wonderful because it documents his discovery and his journey of the real reasons why he's been so fascinated with this individual. It does it very well. Interestingly, it's really actually very moving once you get to sort of the film's climax.
Also, in Winnebago Man, you tell us about oppositional. You talk about oppositional cinema, and that the best ones don't even know that they are oppositional cinema until maybe after the movie comes out, or even years later when people discover that. So tell us what oppositional cinema is.
Oppositional cinema is a term that was coined by Robin Wood, a great film critic. He's Canadian. He taught at York University. So he talks about oppositional cinema. And the interesting thing is, when I was reading his discussion about it, is he says he has some favorites that he calls oppositional cinema. Rio Bravo by Howard Hawks is probably the most famous example of his. He thinks that's a great piece of oppositional cinema. But what's more interesting to me is what he takes oppositional cinema to be. And it's like you said, it's the ones that they don't even know that they're oppositional. So there's no intent at the outset by the director, right, to say, okay, I'm gonna critique power. I'm gonna write, or I'm gonna have like a social documentary that exposes this or that evil. So it's not like we're watching a Michael Moore film. A Michael Moore film is not oppositional cinema in the way that Robin Wood is talking about.
Okay.
He's talking about the free-flowing creativity that you need and the unself-consciousness that you need to tell a story in an honest and genuine way. And that if you tell a story in an honest and genuine way, there will automatically be oppositional elements within it that, if they're allowed to breathe, simply by being represented, they will get out there and do the work that they're supposed to do. But if you can achieve, as an artist, this stance of sort of candidness, or what Matthew Arnold might call disinterestedness, only then can you sort of mine a story or the art that you are trying to present to the world. Only then can its oppositional content really shine through. So yes, you can't be aware beforehand. Being aware of the end goal of creating oppositional cinema is a sign of decadence or selfish wealth, according to John Grierson. I cite him in my book as well. But so you have to have your guard down in a way, because if you have your guard down, you let things sort of come through to the fore. And I think that this film, this documentary film, Ben Steinbauer, and it's documented very well. He doesn't even know why the hell he's going out in search of the Winnebago. And then when he finds Jack Rebney, he doesn't really even know what to ask him or what to ask him to do, or he's got a camera on him and he's got to do something. And he said, okay, what should we do? And he flirts with the idea of, okay, maybe we'll set up a podcast and Jack Rebney can, just start ranting and people will listen to that. But he has no real idea why he's doing what he's doing. And like I said, the movie does work towards a very moving climax. And, what happens is, I make the claim that Jack Rebney, for the first time, sort of faces his fans, the people who have been consuming these videos online, at a found footage film festival. And these people who have been consuming Jack Rebney anonymously for all this time now are faced with the real human being. And both of them recognize in each other in a very moving way. Yeah, both of them recognize in each other how much each of them speak to each other, because neither of them are very interested in engaging with direct oppositional politics, quite frankly. They're not. And I say this in the book. Why would anybody actually want to do that? If, the language of identity politics or the language of, divisive politics, Republican, Democrat, or what have you, all it does is provide the language of discord, right? It doesn't provide grounds for achievement or grounds of agreement of any kind. It only creates people who are bickering with each other. And what the Winnebago Man and the Winnebago Man's fans are kind of doing is they're hiding from all of that. They're hiding in a type of anonymity. But that type of anonymity can never be known in public. But Ben Steinbauer's great achievement is he found this anonymous sort of synergy, this anonymity between Jack Rebney and his fans, who only exist outside of any actual direct cameras filming them, and they sort of found each other in anonymity, and what they're trying to do essentially is they're trying to kind of build, in a way, I say this in the book, the reason that they consume all of these, Jack Rebney videos is they're trying to come up, first of all, with a sense of community. Because if you have a sense of community, then the political work can follow. But if you don't have that sense of community, you just go and you start arguing about sort of that issue or whatever, I mean, it's just never going to go anywhere. And I think that's a very profound and profound political statement that Ben Steinbauer, the director, never meant to document in the first place, and he managed to achieve that. And I think that is very oppositional. That is actually very political. So that's what I tried to talk about.
Fascinating. Movie number 5, The Trotsky. And in a play, you make the comment, in a play, the actor is the projector, as in the film projector. On the movie screen, the subject is projected. Why the difference, and why does it matter between movies and plays?
That is a very important, I would say, ontological difference, especially when talking about tragedy. And it's Stanley Cavell who kind of made that sort of quip about about in a playhouse how the actor is the projector, and that is true. So when you watch tragedy, let's say you're watching a tragedy that happens in a playhouse, you see an actor, a living actor. You see the actor in your presence immediately, and he is projecting onto you. You are kind of on the screen, and there is a synergy there. There is a kind of a relationship between presence between your presence and the actor's presence on the stage. Now, and Stanley Cavell, raises this discussion because he's talking about, what gives us pleasure in watching a tragedy. Like, why do we like watching tragedies? It's so terrible. It's pain and suffering. Why should that be aesthetically pleasing in any sense whatsoever? And many philosophers have tried to answer this question, and there's all kinds of answers, but I still think Stanley Cavell's is the best one. And he says, in the theater, when you're watching, take the case of Othello. You're watching Othello strangle Desdemona. You're watching a man strangle his wife on stage in front of you. Yeah. What the theater allows you to do is it allows you to see a horror played out right before your very eyes in your living presence. But the convention of theater makes it such that you are not supposed to respond, you see? And we get kind of some enjoyment out of that in a way. I mean, you could call it pleasure. Maybe pleasure is kind of not the right word, but that is why we go, to kind of test or elicit these kinds of responses in us, or to see how we would react, knowing full well that we are actually not required to act. For example, if you were at in real life in a cafe, and you looked over and you saw a man strangling his wife or throttling his wife, what would you do? Now that experience probably, right? I mean, this is something you would never think about unless it actually happens. But if you saw that happen in real life, that wouldn't be pleasing. You wouldn't want to see that. No, there's just no way. Do you intervene? Do you not intervene? No, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. But the theater takes that, it takes that away. You don't have to, you're not supposed to act at all. You're just supposed to watch. It elicits the same feeling. And I think that that's true. Now, in the movie, in a cinema house, we are not present to the actors at all. We are mechanically absent, to put it as Stanley Cavell puts it. There's a projector, and there's a screen, and the image is projected onto the screen. And we watch movies in the past tense. There is not this direct participatory element. Movies are already in the hand. We know that they've happened. But in the theater, something is happening in our presence.
Yeah,
and that
in real time.
Right? In real time, yeah. I mean, and you could say, well, we know the actor up there is not really strangling his wife, and we know it's just an actor. I mean, you could say all of those things, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there is a real human being and that there is a real horror, and if you let it, it will elicit the same type of responses as if you were, sitting in a cafe and you were watching this thing happen. But that does not happen in the cinema. I mean, because we are absent. There is that participatory element that is lacking. So why that matters to my discussion, again, is how I was thinking about this book, is whether or not theater can do what tragedy does. Can it make us feel the living presence of the actors that are on screen? And I say, I mean, I guess my conclusion would be it's not quite the same. It's not quite capable, but the conventions that the cinema can harness through the deployment of irony, it can relate to us a sense of meaninglessness that is so profound and so deep that it comes close to what theater knows as tragedy. So it does what theater, it does tragedy via irony and via, and it exposes a sense of meaninglessness, the same sense of meaninglessness we feel when you go to the theater.
Well, the next time I go see a play, I'll think of all of that, because that was fascinating. Movie number 6, Be Kind, Rewind, with Jack Black, one of my favorite comedic actors. And you say, as a medium, as a technology, of course, now this is a while back, because now we have DVDs and Netflix streaming. But anyway, wrote, as a medium, as a technology, video cassettes are all the people have, not to create a civilization for themselves first, but to see themselves first. And then you talk about there was a lot of philosophical discussion about the difference between TV being a small screen and cinema being a big screen. And so, how do you compare TV, cinema, and what I just talked about? We can change video cassettes to DVDs now, or a Netflix live streaming, or all the people have, not to create a civilization for themselves first, but to see themselves first.
The difference between TV and cinema, I think it's an interesting question, and I think that's a great into this film, Be Kind, Rewind. One thing that it kind of seems like a silly question, prima facie, what's the difference, okay? If I watch a movie on the cinema screen, and then it's playing as, it's doing a run on a television network, and I watch it as a show on television. Is there any difference in experience, ontologically? And I'm not really sort of interested in, whether it's different when you see a movie, on your home TV box, or whether you see it on a big screen. I am, though, interested, and I think that this movie is kind of addressing that question in a unique way, in the medium, or the media that is used to watch, whatever story it is that we consume, about, what we take to be maybe our lives, or maybe about other things as well. But whenever we watch movies, what medium are we using to watch them? Now, of course, if we use film, and I use... I talk about Harold Innis, and he's a communications theorist, Canadian communications theorist, and he talks about how the type of media, has ramifications on how we receive the content. And Marshall McLuhan also talks about this. The medium is the message. And that's actually more important. And what's interesting in this movie, Be Kind, Rewind, just again a little bit of a primer for maybe some people who are not familiar with it. It's the Be Kind, Rewind video store. And, they rent video cassettes out to customers. And so Mike is running it. His uncle is absent, or his father-like figure in the film, played by Danny Glover. But he's absent, and Mike is sort of running the store in his stead. And there's some sort of electrical accident that happened at the local power grid. Jerry, who's played by Jack Black, gets kind of electrocuted or whatever. But he's electrocuted, and he walks into the video store, and for some reason, somehow, he erases all the video cassettes. So the blank, the tapes at the store blank. Yeah. And in order to save face, Mike comes up with this idea, Mike played by Mos Def. Mike comes up with this idea where he's going to record by himself, him and Jerry. They're going to recreate all of the films themselves, some props. Jerry is the proprietor of a junkyard. So they find all these props and they start shooting all of these films themselves as a kind of a stopgap measure because they think maybe nobody will notice. But of course, people do notice. This is a process that eventually comes to be known as sweeting a film. So the idea is that you remember the film and you kind of recreate it, react it yourself with your own props, in and amongst your own community, and you just put it on a video cassette. I mean, the idea in the film is called sweeting. I don't know if sweeting ever took off as any kind of phenomenon in real life, but it's kind of an interesting idea about the malleability of a given medium. And you remember with VHS cassettes, right? There was always this idea like you could tape over stuff, right?
Yeah.
With DVDs, it's not quite the same, right? I mean, I don't know. There are rewritable DVDs, but with live stream and stuff like that, there's no chance whatsoever for you to actually record over something. And what I take that record over to be in Be Kind Rewind is a type of participation. Through the act of sweeting, the whole community in that film comes to life, Yeah. So not only do they figure out that the movies have been sweeted, they like it. They like it because they are now able to tell the story in their own way. We talked about, novels requiring the active imagination, as a medium, as an art form, and cinema being much more passive. You're just you just receive it passively. You don't participate in any way in imagining. The imaginative work is done for you. But this movie, in a very interesting way, is proposing an imaginative way that people could participate in the stories that give their lives meaning, the Hollywood movies, could participate in a way at a local level. And I think, to me, that's kind of a very revolutionary, kind of to do. It's kind of really interesting. It gives art, the art that we consume in a rather passive way, that interesting participatory element. Of course, it's all fiction and it never really happened. But in the movie, what's interesting is eventually the studio bigwigs from Hollywood get wind of what's going on in Passaic, New Jersey, a town that doesn't matter to anybody. They're just doing this stuff on their own in a video store or whatever. They get wind of it. Hollywood gets wind of it in this very sad scene. They take all the videotapes and they put them on the road. And then Sigourney Weaver there, she's the person, from Hollywood, studio suit, and she just orders a steamroller in or whatever, and the steamroller just crushes all these videotapes, and it's so sad. It's just so terrible. All this cultural energy is just obliterated and destroyed. And why? Maybe copyright laws or whatever. But I mean, they're not harming anybody. They're not hurting anybody. But I just thought that was an interesting way and an interesting comment on media and medium and trying to make films do something that their medium in itself doesn't usually, we think, allow them to do. And of course, now the move to DVD and from VHS to DVD and now to live stream stuff seals off any participatory element even further, right? It's certainly more, we're much more passive now than if we ever were not passive. Consumption of VHS. So I thought that was all very interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to watch that. That sounds really good. Movie number 7, the last one, Hamlet 2. And in it you talk about Friedrich Nietzsche was the first to recognize that Western culture has achieved a type of liberation resulting in willing for its own sake, that at the heart of the Western cultural experiment is revealed a naked and stark desire for power and domination, made possible by platitudinous bromides to progress, science, and technology, as if these forces contained an ethic. Sounds that really seems to kind of get to the heart of Western imperialism and colonialism. Tell us what you think about that.
I agree. I definitely agree. With what you're saying, and I think Nietzsche was, an interesting guy in that regard. He had some interesting thoughts. I mean, what did he say? He said that all that is revealed is willing. Naked willing, and we don't really know if we don't really have any ethic that constrains it, or So we have to kind of embrace willing for its own sake, the will to power. But we can't do that because there is still a residual ethic, and he says it comes from the ancient world, from Socrates mostly, and even from Christianity. Of course, he didn't like Socrates very much, and he really didn't like Christianity very much, because Christianity brands this will to power as itself evil. And we kind of have to get away from that. We have to stop thinking that it's evil in order to embrace even our self-destructive tendencies, which is something Nietzsche thinks the ancient Greeks were able to do. That's why they are the highest civilization ever. Anyhow, but Nietzsche also says that human beings thrive within a horizon. So there has to be kind of acknowledged limits in a way in order for us to really thrive and do what we want to do. But at the same time, human beings, because now God is dead, we know that all the horizons that we create for ourselves are fake. We know that they're not real. So we're always looking to overcome these horizons. Now, we don't like things, I think we don't like things like theology or philosophy or the humanities as subjects because they're attempts, in a way, of impeding the forward march of technology. And, just the idea of technology, as an assumed good. Because religion or anything like that, when God is dead, there is no stable idea of the good. What is just generally good? No, there is no body or there's no institution that can define what is good for human beings to do or not to do. They don't really have any influence at all. Anybody who attempts to do this is kind of a cultural relic of some kind. So there's kind of a vacuum there of what constitutes the good. And I really do think that in our society, what fills the void is immediately, of course, is technology. And it extends from this idea, this classical idea that the highest good in man is rationality. That's why Nietzsche didn't like very much when Socrates did that. And rationality, of course, gets eventually tied to science, and science and technology, of course, go together. So A equals B equals C, rationality, science, and technology. These things are all just good. We can do it. We figured out how to do it. So if we can do it, why not just do it? But we have no way of asking ourselves another type of question was, wait, is it really good to do this? Should we actually do it? And, two examples you can talk about, we have the technological capability of doing something like fracking, or genetically modified food, right? And so we can do it. So if we can do it, should we do it? And when we make the case that we should do it, we appeal to all kinds of horizons, genetically modified foods. If we pursue this technology, we'll end world hunger one day, or, we will increase crop yields or whatever. So it sounds good. It sounds really good. It's like, hey, okay, I can get on board with that. Let's do it. But we've been doing genetically modified foods for how long now? 50 years at least, probably more. And we haven't done anything about world hunger or anything like that. No. So we know that that horizon is fake. We kind of try and draw it for ourselves, but why do we do it? For power and domination and profits. That's it. That's the only reason. Monsanto just own all of these. That's the only reason they're pursuing all this stuff. There's no ethic there. There is no ethic. And this sort of willing or this sort of drive is endless. And when we realize that there is nothing constraining all of our, mad pursuits of technology, a darkness kind of falls upon our wills, as George Grant puts it. And that is a vision of nihilism. Now, going to the film Hamlet 2, okay, what does this have to do with Hamlet 2? My claim is that in Hamlet 2, Steve Coogan, who plays Dana Marsh, who's a high school drama instructor, he's horizoned in a way by the cultural influence of Hamlet. So in a similar way, when we talk about something like Hamlet, we don't even know why we read Hamlet, or if we should read Hamlet. I think that it's important, but the angst or the anguish that main character expresses in Hamlet 2 is he says, what's so great about Hamlet? Everybody dies, don't you realize it's a tragedy? And what he wants to do, I think, in staging, he doesn't stage Hamlet 2 at the West Mesa High School. He teaches that. He doesn't stage Hamlet, the original, by William Shakespeare. He stages Hamlet 2, which is kind of like a cultural response. And he's trying to express this bewilderment. And he's just trying to say, we need to get beyond the tragedy of Hamlet. We need to forget about all of that pain and suffering. Because we don't know what it's for. We don't even know why we're doing it. We have no way of addressing whether or not Hamlet is good. If Hamlet is any good, or if there's any expressive possibility that is left in that play, first of all, that's a good question. Is there any expressive possibility left to be explored that hasn't already been explored? You know, haven't we read and talked about this play enough? We've talked about it for the better part of 400 years. Are we any wiser for doing it? And if we're not, why did we read it in the first place? And I think at the end of the movie, there is this kind of also like this cathartic failure. There is a catharsis, and it's actually kind of a very like feel-good, warm-hearted kind of movie. And at the end, it does feel sort of kind of warm-hearted in that way. But it's also, I think, meaningless. It's meaningless. The climax of the film is kind of ridiculously, absurdly meaningful, I would say. It's ridiculous and profound. That's what I say in the book. Yeah, so it's a type of failed catharsis. And really what I'm left thinking after watching that movie is, number one, did we ever need Hamlet in the first place? And number two, if we managed to get rid of him, or if we managed in the movie to get rid of him, what next? Like, where do we go from there? We don't even know.
What's the encore?
Right, yeah, so we have no clue. And that, again, is, like I say, like a vision of nihilism. And so the movie brings us, it doesn't have any answers, where we should go, but it brings us to the precipice in a very intelligent way.
Amir, this has been an amazing interview. I've never had a guest on the show who, to discuss something so cultural. And after I read your book, I'm starting to notice, references to movies and stuff, in the popular press and in the news, like with that Martin Scorsese and Francis Coppola, where they were, dissing Marvel comics, and I've started to notice just how, impactful the cinema is in our daily lives. This has just been a superb discussion, and thank you so much. One final question: what do you have in the literary journalistic pipeline these days? I know you're a busy professor, but have you got some sideline projects for yourself?
Always. Yeah. Right now, I have a second book of literary criticism I'm working on Shakespeare's Roman plays. So close reading again of 4 plays. Timon of Athens, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra. And I'm also trying in earnest to now write on Chinese cinema. I'm currently working on a reading of The Wandering Earth, which I think is just a marvelous film. Yeah, and I discussed the ways that this film has sort of ingested aspects of technology fetishism from the West, but at the same time, I think it also provides a very able critique of that fetishization.
I don't want to say I got them legally, but I have about 130 Chinese movies downloaded, and I spent going back to the 1930s. I took the Shanghai. What's that magazine called that all the expats read? It's in all the different big cities. But anyway, I took their 100 top movies that they ranked, and I was able to find most of them, or almost all of them actually, online. Wow. And then I went to the trouble to go to subrip websites and found the English subtitles for probably 85% of them. So if you want to have a crack at those, I'll send you the hyperlink.
Yes. I'm coming to your house. Flash drive.
No, I'll just put them on the cloud, and you can get them in Dalian. And because I love Chinese cinema, it's so gritty and real, and
I agree. I think it's fantastic.
It's so much better, I think, than a lot of Western cinema. But anyway, so I've got like 120 movies, and I think I probably have subtitles for maybe 90 or 100 of them. So I'll send you a cloud link for that for your research.
Wow, thank you so much.
Well, listen, thank you so much, Amir, for coming on. This has just been super fascinating, and I will never go see a movie again with the same eyes. And I have you to thank for it, and I think a lot of our guests and fans out there will feel the same way. Have a wonderful evening, and I'll let you know when this is up, and you can share it with the world.
It was my pleasure being on, Jeff. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.